Today, we're diving into 5 terrors that haunted American soldiers in Vietnam. These are the fears that veterans specifically requested to be covered. What you're about to hear isn't sanitized history. This is the raw, visceral reality of what made Vietnam such a psychologically brutal conflict. Some of this might be difficult to hear, but it's important that we understand what these men went through. If you're a veteran watching this, you already know these fears intimately. For everyone else, pay attention, because this is the side of war that rarely makes it into textbooks or movies. Let's get into it. The first fear we need to discuss is one that carries a particularly bitter irony: friendly fire. In Vietnam, the chaotic nature of jungle warfare, combined with massive American firepower, created conditions where soldiers were often as afraid of their own side's weapons as they were of the enemy. According to military studies and declassified reports, friendly fire incidents were significantly more common in Vietnam than in previous American conflicts. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. Artillery and air support. American forces had overwhelming firepower superiority, but in the dense jungle, that became a double-edged sword. When units called in artillery support or airstrikes, the proximity of friendly forces to enemy positions meant that small errors in coordinates or timing could be catastrophic. Veterans described the terror of calling in fire support danger close, meaning within 600 meters of friendly positions. One forward observer, in a documented interview, stated, "You're radioing coordinates, and you know that if you transpose a single digit, those shells are going to land on your own men instead of the enemy." The responsibility was crushing. Napalm strikes were particularly feared. The jellied gasoline weapon created firestorms that could spread unpredictably through jungle terrain. Multiple veterans have recounted incidents where napalm drifted from its intended target zone and engulfed friendly positions. The screams of men burning from American napalm are described in several memoir accounts as among the most haunting memories veterans carry. Arc Light missions. Massive B-52 bombing runs created another dimension of friendly fire fear. These strikes would devastate square miles of jungle, but coordination errors occasionally put American units in the impact zone. Veterans described the psychological terror of hearing B-52s overhead and suddenly wondering if someone had made a mistake with the coordinates. Night firefights and confusion. The majority of enemy attacks happened at night, creating conditions of extreme chaos and confusion. In the darkness of the jungle, with visibility measured in feet rather than yards, identifying friend from foe became extraordinarily difficult. Veterans consistently described the fear of shooting at movement and discovering you'd hit someone from your own unit. The phrase, "check your fire," appears repeatedly in after-action reports and veteran testimonies. A desperate call in the middle of firefights when soldiers realized they might be shooting toward friendly positions. Tracers, bullets that create visible light trails, helped with aim but also created confusion. In the chaos of night combat, soldiers described the disorientation of seeing tracers going in multiple directions and being uncertain which were incoming enemy fire and which were outgoing friendly fire. Radio communication failures. Radio communication was the lifeline that prevented friendly fire, but radios failed constantly in Vietnam's humid jungle environment. Batteries died, equipment malfunctioned, dense vegetation blocked signals, and enemy jamming disrupted communications. Multiple documented incidents involve units losing radio contact and then being hit by American artillery or airstrikes because forward observers couldn't call off the fire missions. One Marine veteran described in an oral history, "Our radio went dead in the middle of calling in artillery. We could hear the shells coming but couldn't tell them to stop. We just had to dig in and pray they'd realize something was wrong." Fragging, the ultimate friendly fire fear. We need to address the darkest aspect of friendly fire: intentional attacks on fellow soldiers, particularly officers and NCOs, a practice that became known as fragging because fragmentation grenades were the most common weapon used. According to military records, there were over 800 documented fragging incidents between 1969 and 1972, with the actual number likely being higher as many incidents were covered up or misreported. This represented a complete breakdown of unit cohesion in certain circumstances. Veterans describe the psychological impact of knowing that the greatest danger might not be the enemy in the jungle, but the disgruntled soldier in your own hooch. Officers and NCOs who pushed their men too hard, who were seen as unnecessarily risking lives, or who were simply disliked faced the possibility of a grenade rolled into their tent at night. One Army lieutenant, in a documented testimony, stated, "I was more afraid of my own men than I was of Charlie. At least with the enemy, you knew they were trying to kill you. With fragging, it could be the guy you'd been sharing rations with for months." The fear of fragging created a corrosive atmosphere of distrust within units. Leaders had to balance military necessity against the risk of their own men turning on them. This wasn't just paranoia. It was a real, documented phenomenon that fundamentally changed how some units functioned. The second fear cuts to a primal human terror, being left behind in hostile territory, or, worse, being captured by the enemy. The fear of being overrun. Fire support bases and small outposts dotted the Vietnamese countryside, often surrounded by enemy-controlled territory. Soldiers stationed at these locations lived with the constant knowledge that they could be overrun if the enemy attacked in sufficient force. Veterans from battles like Firebase Mary and Firebase Ripcord and dozens of smaller, less-known engagements described the terror of being under sustained attack and wondering if this was the moment when the position would be overrun. The question wasn't theoretical. Numerous American positions were overrun during the war. One veteran of the siege of Firebase Cape described in a recorded interview, "When the human wave attacks started coming, and you're firing until your barrel's glowing, and they just keep coming, you start doing mental math. How many magazines do I have left? How long until I'm out? And what happens when I run out of ammunition and they're still coming?" The fear wasn't just about dying in combat. It was about being overrun alive, being captured, and what would happen next. Helicopter evacuation fears. The helicopter became the symbol of American mobility in Vietnam, but it also created a specific kind of anxiety, the fear of being left behind during an evacuation. Dust-off missions, medical evacuations, usually had enough space for casualties, but combat extractions from hot LZs often involved difficult decisions about who could fit on the helicopter. Veterans described the gut-wrenching moments when helicopters took fire, began leaving, and men were still on the ground. One door gunner, in a documented testimony, described the worst moments of his service, looking down and seeing guys running for the bird, and we're already lifting off because we're taking too much fire. The look in their eyes when they realize we're leaving. That haunts me. The fear of being the one left behind, of watching the helicopter lift off while you're still on the ground with the enemy closing in, appears repeatedly in veteran accounts of combat assaults gone wrong. Behind enemy lines, pilots, air crews, and reconnaissance teams faced a specific variation of this fear, being shot down or cut off behind enemy lines. According to military records, hundreds of American aircraft were shot down over North Vietnam and Laos, and many crew members survived the crashes only to face capture or evasion in hostile territory. The fear wasn't just about crashing, it was about what came after. SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, prepared aircrews for this possibility, but veterans who went through it described the training as terrifying precisely because it made clear what they might face if captured. The training included realistic simulations of interrogation and torture designed to prepare men for the worst. Long-range reconnaissance patrol, LRRP, teams operated deep in enemy territory, often days away from any friendly forces. These small teams, usually 4 to 6 men, lived with the knowledge that if they were discovered, extraction might not be possible before they were overrun. One LRRP veteran described the constant tension. "We were ghosts. The whole mission was about not being detected, because if they found us, we were outnumbered hundreds to 1. The radio might bring help, or it might just mean someone would know where we died." Prisoner of war, the ultimate fear. For many veterans, the absolute worst-case scenario wasn't death. It was capture and imprisonment by the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong. Stories of POW treatment were known among American forces. The Hanoi Hilton, the torture techniques, the years of captivity. These weren't abstract concepts. They were real possibilities that soldiers carried in the back of their minds. According to documented POW testimonies after their release, treatment ranged from harsh to brutal. Torture was systematic and designed to extract propaganda statements and break prisoners psychologically. Years of solitary confinement, inadequate food, disease, and physical abuse were standard. Veterans described the calculus they made, saving the last round for yourself rather than being captured. This isn't Hollywood dramatization. Multiple veterans have confirmed in documented interviews that they carried this intention. As one Marine stated, "We all knew guys who said they'd never be taken alive. Some carried extra grenades specifically for that purpose. Better to take yourself out than spend years being tortured." The fear of capture was compounded by reports, some confirmed, others rumored, of what happened to prisoners who didn't make it to official POW camps. Summary executions, torture that ended in death, and bodies left as warnings to other Americans. Missing in action, the family's nightmare. There's another dimension to this fear that extended beyond the soldiers themselves. The terror of being listed as missing in action and what that would mean for their families. Over 1,600 Americans remain unaccounted for from the Vietnam War. For soldiers, the fear wasn't just about their own fate, but about leaving their families in perpetual uncertainty. Would their families spend decades not knowing if they were dead or alive? Would they be listed as deserters? Would they ever be found? Veterans who survived near-capture experiences often describe relief not just for themselves, but for their families who would have faced that uncertainty. One veteran who evaded capture after his helicopter was shot down stated, "My fear wasn't dying. It was my mother spending the rest of her life wondering if I was still alive somewhere, being tortured, hoping I'd come home. That thought kept me moving when I wanted to just hide and wait." The third fear is the jungle itself, specifically the deadly creatures and diseases that made Vietnam's environment as dangerous as the enemy forces. Venomous snakes. Vietnam was home to some of the world's most deadly snakes, and they were everywhere. The bamboo viper, also called the bamboo pit viper, was among the most feared. These snakes were perfectly camouflaged to look like bamboo, making them nearly invisible in the jungle vegetation where they lived. According to military medical records, snake bites were a regular occurrence. The bamboo viper's venom caused severe tissue damage, massive swelling, and could be fatal without treatment. The problem was that soldiers often operated days away from medical facilities where antivenom was available. Veterans described the constant fear of what you couldn't see. One infantry sergeant stated in an oral history, "Every time you grabbed a branch, every time you sat down, every time you reached into vegetation, you wondered if you were about to grab a bamboo viper. Their bite could kill you in hours, and we were often 3 days from a hospital." The Malayan pit viper was another deadly threat. These snakes were active at night, the same time soldiers were most active during operations. They would lie motionless on trails, and stepping on one could result in a strike. The venom caused massive hemorrhaging and tissue death. Various species of cobras also inhabited Vietnam's jungles. The monocled cobra, king cobra, and spitting cobra all posed threats. King cobras could grow over 15 feet long and inject massive amounts of neurotoxic venom. Spitting cobras could spray venom into eyes from several feet away, causing blindness. One Marine described a night patrol encounter. "We were moving through thick jungle at night, and suddenly the guy in front of me is screaming. A cobra had struck him on the leg. We couldn't see it, couldn't kill it, just had to get him back to base as fast as possible and hope he'd survive the evacuation." The Krites, including the Malayan Krite and banded Krite, were nocturnal hunters with extremely potent neurotoxic venom. Their bites were often painless initially, meaning soldiers might not realize they'd been bitten until symptoms began: muscle paralysis, difficulty breathing, and potential respiratory failure. Giant centipedes and scorpions. Vietnamese centipedes could grow over a foot long, with some specimens recorded at 14 inches. These weren't just large, they were venomous and aggressive. The venom caused excruciating pain that veterans describe as worse than many combat injuries. One medic documented, "I had a soldier bitten by a centipede on his arm while he was sleeping. The pain was so intense he was screaming louder than men I'd seen shot. His entire arm swelled up like a balloon. The pain lasted for days." These centipedes would crawl into boots, sleeping bags, clothing, and equipment. Veterans described the ritual of shaking out everything before use, knowing that a centipede hiding in a boot could deliver a bite that would incapacitate you. Scorpions added another threat. While not as deadly as some of the snakes, scorpion stings were intensely painful and could cause serious complications. They would hide in dark, confined spaces, exactly the kinds of places soldiers would reach into without looking. Malaria and mosquito-borne diseases. Malaria was one of the greatest disease threats in Vietnam. According to military medical statistics, there were over 80,000 confirmed cases of malaria among U.S. forces during the war, with the actual number likely much higher. The disease could kill quickly if untreated. Veterans describe watching fellow soldiers go from healthy to delirious with fever in a matter of hours. The high fever, chills, sweating, and potential for cerebral malaria made it a life-threatening condition in the field. Anti-malarial medications were distributed, but they had severe side effects and weren't always effective against drug-resistant strains. Some soldiers described the medication making them feel almost as sick as the disease it was supposed to prevent. One infantry soldier stated, "You'd wake up one morning feeling wrong. By afternoon, you're burning up with fever, can't stand, can't think straight. If you were out on patrol when it hit, you became a liability to your entire unit. We had to carry guys out who were too delirious to walk." Dengue fever was another mosquito-borne threat. Called breakbone fever because of the intense joint and muscle pain, dengue could be debilitating. Unlike malaria, there was no prevention and no treatment, just managing symptoms and hoping for survival. Japanese encephalitis, transmitted by mosquitoes, could cause brain inflammation, seizures, and death. While less common than malaria, its severity made it a feared disease. The mosquitoes themselves were inescapable. Veterans describe being covered in hundreds of mosquitoes simultaneously, the constant buzzing, the welts from countless bites. Bug repellent would sweat off within hours in the humid jungle, leaving soldiers defenseless. Leeches. Leeches appear in virtually every Vietnam veteran's account because they were omnipresent and revolting. These blood-sucking parasites would attach to any exposed skin and, disturbingly, would sometimes work their way under clothing or into body orifices. Veterans describe discovering leeches attached in dozens of places during leech checks, a regular ritual where soldiers would examine themselves and each other. The leeches would gorge themselves on blood, swelling to many times their original size. Removing leeches improperly could cause the head to remain embedded, leading to infection. The standard methods, cigarettes, salt, or careful removal with a knife, all had to be done carefully to avoid leaving parts of the leech behind. One soldier described, "You'd pull off your boots and there'd be leeches between your toes, attached to your feet." Immersion foot and jungle rot. The combination of constant moisture and tropical heat created perfect conditions for immersion foot, also called jungle rot or trench foot. This wasn't just discomfort, it was a serious medical condition where skin would literally rot away. Veterans describe feet that were never dry, perpetually white and wrinkled from constant moisture. The skin would begin to peel off in sheets. Fungal infections would eat through healthy tissue. The smell of rotting flesh became a constant companion. The pain was intense. Veterans describe having to put boots on feet where the skin had largely come off, walking on raw flesh because the mission couldn't stop. Some soldiers lost toes or parts of their feet to the condition. One infantry soldier stated, "Your feet stopped looking like feet after a couple months. The skin was gone in places, you could see raw tissue. But you still had to walk 10 to 15 kilometers a day with 60 pounds of gear. Every step was agony." Medical treatment was limited in the field. Without the ability to keep feet dry and clean, the condition would continue to worsen. Soldiers whose immersion foot became severe enough would eventually need evacuation, but commanders were often reluctant to evacuate for what was seen as a preventable condition. Infections from minor wounds. In the jungle environment, any cut, scrape, or puncture wound could become seriously infected within days. The combination of heat, humidity, dirt, and constant moisture created perfect conditions for bacterial infections. Veterans describe watching minor wounds, a scratch from bamboo, a small cut from vegetation, a blister that broke, turn into serious infections. The flesh around wounds would become red, swollen, and filled with pus. Without antibiotics, these infections could become life-threatening. Tropical ulcers were particularly nasty. What started as a small wound would develop into a crater of dead tissue that could eat down to the bone. These ulcers were extremely painful and difficult to treat in field conditions. One medic described the challenge. We'd see guys with wounds that should have healed in a week back home, but in the jungle they'd get infected and just keep getting worse. Sometimes we'd have to cut away infected tissue with no anesthesia just to keep the infection from spreading. Rabies and other animal-borne diseases. Vietnam had numerous species capable of carrying rabies: bats, monkeys, dogs, and other mammals. Rabies is almost always fatal once symptoms appear, making any bite from a mammal a potential death sentence. Veterans described the fear of being bitten by animals and not knowing if they'd been exposed to rabies. In some cases, soldiers bitten by potentially rabid animals had to receive the rabies vaccine series, a painful treatment that required multiple injections. Monkey bites were particularly feared because monkeys in Vietnam often carried diseases, including rabies. Yet monkeys were common around base camps and villages, creating regular exposure to the threat. Various parasitic infections could be acquired through contact with contaminated water or soil. Hookworms, roundworms, and other parasites could cause serious health problems. Some parasites could remain in the body for years after exposure, causing chronic health issues. Water contamination and waterborne illness. Finding safe drinking water was a constant challenge. Vietnamese water sources were often contaminated with human waste, agricultural chemicals, and disease-causing organisms. Dysentery was common and could be severely debilitating. Veterans described the violent diarrhea, dehydration, and weakness that came with waterborne illnesses. In combat situations, being incapacitated by dysentery could put entire units at risk. Cholera outbreaks occurred in various regions. This disease causes such severe diarrhea and vomiting that victims can die from dehydration within hours. The fear of cholera made water safety a constant concern. Iodine tablets could purify water but made it taste terrible. Some soldiers, desperate and thirsty, would drink untreated water and subsequently develop serious illnesses that required evacuation. Heat casualties. The heat and humidity of Vietnam created life-threatening conditions even without combat. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke killed and incapacitated soldiers regularly. Veterans describe carrying 60 to 80 pounds of gear in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit with near 100% humidity. The air was so thick with moisture that breathing felt difficult. Sweating provided no cooling because the sweat couldn't evaporate in the saturated air. Heat stroke could kill quickly. Soldiers would collapse, body temperatures would spike to dangerous levels, and without immediate cooling and medical intervention, they would die. Heat stroke could also cause permanent brain damage in survivors. One platoon leader described a patrol. "We had 3 men go down with heat casualties in one afternoon. They just collapsed. We had to call for dust-off because they were unconscious and burning up. The heat was as much an enemy as Charlie was." The fourth fear centers on one of the most terrifying aspects of the Vietnam War: the massive tunnel complexes and a nightmare of underground combat. The tunnel systems. The Viet Congs and North Vietnamese Army constructed elaborate tunnel systems that stretched for hundreds of miles. Cu Chi tunnels alone covered over 150 miles of underground passages, with multiple levels, living quarters, hospitals, storage facilities, and fighting positions. These weren't crude holes in the ground. They were sophisticated underground bases that allowed the enemy to appear and disappear seemingly at will. American forces could be standing directly on top of a large enemy force and have no idea they were there. Veterans described the psychological impact of knowing the enemy could be anywhere, including directly beneath your feet. One soldier stated, "You'd be in what you thought was a secure area, and suddenly trapdoors would open and VC would pop up, shoot, and disappear before you could react. The ground itself couldn't be trusted." Tunnel rats, the most dangerous job. Tunnel rats were soldiers who volunteered or were ordered to enter and clear these tunnel systems. This was widely considered one of the most dangerous and terrifying jobs in Vietnam. The tunnels were deliberately built small, often so narrow that average-sized American soldiers could barely fit. They were pitch black, oxygen depleted, and filled with threats. Tunnel rats had to crawl through these confined spaces, often alone, never knowing what they'd encounter. According to documented accounts, tunnel rats would enter with only a flashlight, a pistol, and sometimes a knife. The confined space made rifles impractical. They crawled through darkness, through water, through chambers filled with bats and rats, never knowing if the next turn would bring them face to face with an enemy soldier. One tunnel rat described the experience. You're crawling through a space barely wider than your shoulders, in complete darkness except for your flashlight. You can't turn around. You can only go forward or back up the way you came. And you know there might be VC waiting around any corner, ready to shoot you in the head or stab you. Underground combat. When tunnel rats encountered enemy soldiers in the tunnels, the resulting combat was claustrophobic and brutal. Fighting in pitch darkness, in spaces too confined to maneuver, often ended up being hand-to-hand combat or point-blank shootouts. The muzzle flash from a pistol in the confined space would temporarily blind the shooter. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed tunnel was deafening. The confined space meant that missing was difficult, but also that there was no cover and no escape. Veterans who fought in tunnels describe it as the most primal, terrifying combat they experienced. One tunnel rat stated, "It wasn't like combat above ground. It was like being buried alive and having to fight your way out. The darkness, the closeness, knowing you can't retreat quickly, it was pure survival instinct." Knife fights happened in tunnels when soldiers literally ran into each other in the dark. These encounters were silent, brutal, and decided in seconds. The survivor would have to continue through the tunnel, knowing there might be more enemy soldiers ahead. Spider holes and trapdoors. Even more terrifying than the major tunnel systems were the countless spider holes, small, camouflaged fighting positions that a single enemy soldier could hide in, attack from, and disappear into. These holes could be anywhere. A trapdoor covered with vegetation might be in the middle of a trail, in a rice paddy, inside a village hut, or right in the middle of an American base's perimeter. Viet Cong's fighter would wait until Americans were literally stepping on top of the concealed entrance, then shoot from point-blank range and disappear. Veterans described the paranoia this created. Every patch of ground could be concealing an enemy soldier. Every surface could have a hidden trapdoor. You couldn't trust the ground you walked on. One squad leader described a devastating ambush. "We were walking through what looked like open ground. Suddenly, trapdoors opened up all around us. VC popped up, fired, and dropped back down before we could return fire effectively. 3 of my men were hit in seconds, and we never even saw the shooters." Gas attacks in tunnels. The U.S. military used CS gas, tear gas, and other chemical agents to try to clear tunnels and force enemy soldiers out. But this created additional dangers for tunnel rats and soldiers near tunnel entrances. The gas could linger in tunnels for hours, making them dangerous to enter even after deployment. Tunnel rats describe putting on gas masks to enter tunnels, then having to remove them in tight spaces where the mask wouldn't fit, exposing themselves to residual gas. Viet Congs also used gas techniques. They would detonate tear gas or smoke in tunnels to flush out American tunnel rats, or use the ventilation systems of their tunnels to create safe areas while Americans above ground were exposed to gas. Psychological terror of enclosed spaces. Even soldiers who didn't serve as tunnel rats described the psychological horror of tunnel warfare. The idea of being underground, in the dark, in confined spaces where you couldn't maneuver or retreat effectively tapped into primal claustrophobic fears. Veterans who cleared bunkers or investigated underground positions described the adrenaline spike when approaching a tunnel entrance, never knowing what might be inside. The natural human instinct to avoid confined, dark spaces had to be overcome to do the job. For actual tunnel rats, the psychological toll was immense. Many developed anxiety around confined spaces that persisted long after leaving Vietnam. The experience of crawling through pitch-black tunnels, never knowing if the next moment would bring a bullet, a booby trap, or an enemy soldier, created trauma that many describe as worse than conventional combat. The fifth fear was that nowhere was truly safe, not even supposedly secure base camps. Enemy sappers and coordinated attacks on bases meant that even when soldiers weren't on patrol, they could wake up to all-out combat. Sapper attacks, silent death. Sappers were elite Viet Congs and NVA infiltration specialists who specialized in penetrating American defenses silently to plant explosives or attack from within the perimeter. They were some of the most feared enemy forces. These soldiers would strip down to nearly nothing. often wearing only shorts and carrying satchel charges, grenades, and perhaps a knife. They would cover themselves in mud or charcoal to blend into the darkness and eliminate any reflective surfaces or scent that dogs might detect. According to military records and veteran accounts, sappers would spend hours slowly crawling through defensive perimeters, cutting wire, avoiding mines, and positioning themselves throughout a base before the actual attack began. Their patience and skill were legendary and terrifying. One perimeter guard described a sapper attack. You'd be on guard duty, staring into the darkness, and you wouldn't see or hear anything wrong. Then suddenly there'd be explosions throughout the base, ammunition dumps, fuel storage, command bunkers, all going off at once. The sappers had been inside our perimeter for hours, and we never detected them. Penetrating the defenses. American bases were surrounded by elaborate defensive systems, multiple layers of concertina wire, claymore mines, trip flares, cleared fields of fire, watchtowers with searchlights, and constant patrols. Yet sappers regularly breached these defenses. They used various techniques documented in after-action reports. Some would lie still for hours, allowing American patrols to pass within feet of them. Some would use bamboo poles to probe for and mark mine locations, then crawl through the cleared paths. Some would cut single wires at a time over the course of hours to create passages through wire barriers. The psychological impact on perimeter guards was severe. Veterans described the constant questioning. Was that shadow moving, or was it your imagination? Was that sound something, or just wind? Knowing that sappers could be anywhere, moving invisibly toward you, created a paranoia that never allowed for relaxation. Satchel charges and demolition. Sappers carried satchel charges, bags full of explosives designed to destroy specific targets. Their primary objectives were typically high-value targets: ammunition stores, fuel depots, aircraft, artillery pieces, and command bunkers. The explosions from sapper attacks could be massive. An ammunition dump going up could create secondary explosions that lasted for hours, sending ordnance cooking off in all directions. Fuel depots would create massive fireballs. The destruction could be catastrophic. Veterans describe waking to explosions throughout their base, not knowing where the sappers were, how many there were, or what they'd targeted. The confusion and chaos of a sapper attack created opportunities for the enemy to escape in the chaos they'd created. One artilleryman described the aftermath of a sapper attack on his fire base. They hit our ammunition storage. We had artillery shells cooking off for 6 hours. We couldn't go near that area. 3 sappers had destroyed enough ammunition to supply our base for a month, and they got away in the chaos. Human wave attacks on bases. While sappers worked silently, coordinated mass attacks on American bases were loud, violent, and overwhelming. Viet Congs and NVA would launch human wave attacks, hundreds or even thousands of soldiers simultaneously assaulting a base from multiple directions. These attacks often began with intense mortar and rocket barrages to suppress defensive fire and destroy key positions. Then waves of infantry would charge the perimeter, accepting heavy casualties to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Veterans from battles like Firebase Illingworth, Mary and numerous smaller engagements described the terror of facing human wave attacks. One Marine stated, "You're firing on full automatic. You see men dropping, and they just keep coming. More and more of them. You start wondering if you have enough ammunition, if the perimeter will hold, if this is the night you get overrun." The sound of hundreds of enemy soldiers shouting and screaming as they charged, combined with whistles, bugles, and explosions, created a cacophony designed to inspire terror. The psychological warfare aspect was as important as the physical assault. Mortars and rockets, no warning. Even without ground assaults, American bases were subjected to regular mortar and rocket attacks. These indirect fire attacks could come at any time, day or night, with little to no warning. 122mm rockets had a range of over 10 kilometers and carried substantial explosive warheads. Mortars could be set up quickly, fired, and broken down before American counter-battery fire could respond. The enemy could attack from positions that were difficult to locate and impossible to assault effectively. Veterans describe living with the constant possibility of incoming fire. You could be eating, sleeping, using the latrine, writing a letter home, and suddenly rockets or mortars would start landing. There was no warning, no time to prepare, just the whistle of incoming rounds and the need to find cover immediately. Some guys developed a sixth sense about it and would hit the ground seconds before the first round landed. Others weren't so lucky. The phrase, incoming, would send everyone diving for bunkers. The sounds of explosions, the screams of wounded soldiers, the chaos of trying to find cover while rounds continued to fall. These attacks kept every base on edge constantly. Insider attacks. An insidious variation of base camp threats came from insider attacks by South Vietnamese soldiers, civilian workers, or infiltrators who had gained access to American bases through seemingly legitimate means. According to military records, there were numerous incidents of ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, soldiers turning on Americans, or of civilian workers on bases who were actually Viet Cong intelligence gathering or waiting for an opportunity to strike. Veterans described the difficulty of knowing who to trust. The ARVN soldier you worked alongside could be VC. The woman who did laundry on base could be reporting positions of ammunition and fuel storage. The interpreter could be feeding information to the enemy. One officer described the paranoia. You couldn't fully trust anyone Vietnamese. Maybe they were loyal, maybe they weren't. We had incidents where ARVN opened fire on Americans during joint operations. You had to sleep with one eye open even around supposed allies. This created a corrosive atmosphere where racial suspicion and distrust became normalized. The inability to distinguish friend from foe extended even to people who were supposedly on the same side. Fire-based sieges. Some American positions endured prolonged sieges lasting days or weeks. Fire support base Ripcord was under sustained attack for 23 days. Hy Sen was besieged for 77 days. During these extended battles, soldiers lived under constant bombardment and threat of ground assault. The psychological strain of prolonged sieges was immense. Sleep deprivation from constant alerts, the steady attrition of casualties, dwindling supplies, and the uncertainty of whether relief would arrive before the position was overrun created unbearable stress. Veterans of these sieges describe a state of exhausted terror, too tired to maintain proper alertness, but too afraid to sleep, wondering each day if this would be the day the enemy launched the final assault that would overrun the position. One veteran of FSB Ripcord stated, "We knew they were out there, in the jungle surrounding us, watching, waiting. Every night we expected them to come. We'd been hit so many times, lost so many men. We started wondering if we'd all die there, if anyone would make it out." The illusion of safety. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of base camp attacks was that they destroyed the illusion of safety. Forward operating bases, fire support bases, and even large base camps that seemed well defended proved vulnerable. Soldiers would come back from dangerous patrols looking forward to the relative safety of base, only to have that base attacked. The one place they thought they could relax and feel secure wasn't safe either. This created a state of constant hypervigilance with no relief. If you weren't safe on patrol and you weren't safe at base, when could you ever let your guard down? Veterans describe this as one of the most exhausting aspects of Vietnam, the absence of any true safe zone where they could mentally and physically recover. Ammunition and fuel explosions. When sappers or rockets hit ammunition storage or fuel depots, the resulting explosions could be catastrophic. Secondary explosions from cooking off ammunition could last for hours or even days, making entire sections of bases inaccessible and dangerous. Flying shrapnel from exploding ammunition could kill or wound soldiers hundreds of meters away. Fuel fires created intense heat and toxic smoke. The chaos made it difficult to organize effective defense or counterattack. Veterans described the nightmarish scenario of trying to defend a base while your own ammunition supply was exploding, sending deadly fragments in all directions. One soldier stated, "Our own ammunition was killing more of us than the initial attack did. We had to evacuate half the base because shells were cooking off and we couldn't get near them." The aftermath. Even after attacks ended, the aftermath was horrific. Counting casualties, treating wounded soldiers, recovering bodies, assessing damage, and trying to restore defenses while exhausted and traumatized created additional psychological burdens. Veterans describe walking through bases after major attacks and seeing the devastation, destroyed equipment, cratered ground, damaged bunkers, blood trails, and the bodies of friends and fellow soldiers. The work of recovery had to begin immediately, even while everyone was still processing the trauma of the attack. The fear of the next attack started immediately after the previous one ended. Would they come back tonight? Tomorrow? Were more sappers already inside the perimeter, waiting for darkness to strike again? Friendly fire, being left behind or captured, deadly wildlife and disease, tunnel warfare, and base camp attacks complete a broader picture of what made Vietnam such a psychologically brutal conflict. What connects all 10 fears we've discussed across both videos is a common theme: the absence of safety and the omnipresence of death. Unlike conventional warfare with front lines and rear areas, Vietnam presented threats that were constant, unpredictable, and inescapable. You could be killed by enemy action, friendly fire, disease, venomous creatures, environmental conditions, or even fellow American soldiers. You weren't safe on patrol, you weren't safe at base, you weren't safe above ground or below it. You weren't safe day or night. The jungle itself was hostile. The ground beneath your feet might conceal enemies or mines. The vegetation around you might hide snipers or venomous snakes. The water you needed to drink might be contaminated. The air you breathed was thick with disease-carrying mosquitoes. According to military psychiatric research and decades of PTSD studies on Vietnam veterans, this sustained, inescapable threat created psychological damage that proved more severe and longer-lasting than combat in wars with clearer battle lines and defined safe zones. Veterans described the impossibility of ever fully relaxing, of ever fully letting their guard down. The constant vigilance required for survival became so ingrained that many veterans report it never fully went away, even decades after leaving Vietnam. The fears we've discussed weren't paranoia or imagination. They were rational responses to genuine, documented threats that killed and wounded hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. Every fear we've covered was based on real incidents, real casualties, and real dangers that soldiers face daily. Understanding these fears is crucial to understanding the Vietnam War experience. It's not enough to know about the major battles or the political context. The daily, grinding reality of living under constant threat from multiple sources, that's what defined the war for the men who fought it. These weren't just soldiers in a war. They were young men, many still teenagers, thrust into an environment that seemed designed to kill them in as many different ways as possible. The fact that over 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam is tragic. The fact that millions more came home carrying these fears and traumas for the rest of their lives is equally significant. If you're a Vietnam veteran watching this, thank you for your service and your sacrifice. I hope these videos accurately represented the reality you lived through. If there are other fears or experiences you feel should be included, please share them in the comments below. For everyone else, if you found this educational and want to better understand the Vietnam War experience, please share this video. Like and subscribe for more historical content that goes beyond the sanitized versions you find in textbooks. Remember what was asked of these soldiers. And remember that the men who survived carry these memories still. Thank you for watching.